Well, good morning, everybody. What we are going to do is a little makeup on the evolution of flight training. I know when I went through flight training, I never gave it a thought as to why it was set up the way it was. But here, as we did the celebration of the First World War, we started to realize that more and more things that took place during the First World War are with us today. The size of the roads that we drive on, manners of speech that we use, words that we use, all have their derivation in the First World War. And that also is the case where flight training is concerned. Flight training now is done an awful lot like it was done 100 years ago. But how did that all get started? You know, you have to take a look at what the First World War did to all of us, or did to the world, in terms of the changes and the metamorphoses that took place. Nothing like it had ever taken place before, and so it was very, very different in terms of having to get ready for the war and everything else. So part of that came through, we didn't know how to mobilize. Benjamin Falloy, this gentleman here in the corner, was the father of the Air Force at the time, and he was tasked with doing the training for the requirements. But where did the requirements come from what we were asked? Well, actually, the requirements for what we were going to contribute to the war effort came from the French. Keep in mind that we entered the war in 1917, but the French and the Germans, and obviously the British and the Russians, had already been at war since 1914. So when we entered the war in 1917, the French requested a few things of us, that by January, in other words, in about 6 to 7 months, hi Philip, good to see you, in 6 to 7 months, they wanted the U.S. to contribute 21,000 airplanes. Keep in mind that at this point in time, here's our Air Force, right here. That's all of the airplanes of the United States Air Force in 1915, about 6 airplanes. This is about a year and a half later, and what the French wanted from us was 21,000 airplanes, 4,500 trainers, the trainer airplanes, 16,500 other aircraft unspecified at that point in time. They wanted 30,000 engines from us. They wanted 5,000 pilots, and they wanted 50,000 mechanics and support people. We had no idea how to do that. And it was tasked, and Benjamin Falloy was tasked with trying to come up with that. So Falloy put together what he thought was going to be the mobilization plan, and he thought that they could probably produce about 16,900 aircraft. Was going to be about 5,000 trainers, about 6,600 fighters, 4,000 reconnaissance airplanes, and about 1,300 bombers. And they only thought they could produce about 24,000 engines. Now again, this is mobilization on a scale that had never taken place before. So aircraft manufacturers were considered to not be sufficient, so they started to switch over to having people like Ford and Chevrolet work on some of these. And then they did feel that they could come up with 50,000 mechanics and support people. But what was the training process going to be like? That was another thing that we didn't know how to do at that point in time, because we had never done anything like that. So we used what was referred to as the French and the British model. And I'm just going to kind of scan around and show you some things. This is a typical World War I airfield. This particular one is down at Kelly, I believe. But they were all kind of the same way. They were all cookie cutter in terms of the hangars. You'll see the airplanes here are Jennies. They're JN4 Jennies. That was the most common airplane of the time that was used. We used airplanes called Canucks here in the Fort Worth area, but the rest of the country used the JN4s, the regular JN4s. Of all of the training facilities in the United States, Texas ended up with about 24% of them. We started out at the beginning of the war in San Antonio with the only airfield in the state, and by the end of the war we had 24 different airfields and facilities. Some of those here in Fort Worth and in Dallas and in Mineral Wells, in Waco, and a number of different places. But the French and English model for training required that the pilots start out with ground school in terms of learning about flight dynamics and learning about how the airplanes went together, weather, engines, all types of different things. And the way they decided to do that was to use what they referred to as the School of Military Aeronautics. It was called the SMA. And what took place is that when you decided you were going to be a pilot and signed up to be a pilot or a mechanic, you were sent to one of 8 universities around the country. I don't have the complete list in front of me. I used to know them, but it's like University of Texas, University of Illinois, University of Ohio. I think Cornell was one of them. MIT was one of them. The schools provided space for the military to be able to train in, and they would bring pilots in and go through ground school at 8 universities. Now it was 8 weeks of ground school training. It was 3 weeks of general military subjects, and then it was 5 weeks of actual training on aviation itself. Once that was completed, and again, they were seeing airplanes in classrooms, but this didn't have anything to do with actually flying airplanes or building them or anything else. After that, they went to a concentration camp. Now, I know that has a different connotation now than it did at the time, but they went to a place called Fort Dick. Fort Dick was here in Dallas. It's essentially where the Dallas, the Texas Fairgrounds are. And they went to Fort Dick. All of the pilots did. And they went there awaiting their assignments to flight schools. So essentially 23,000 people applied, and by the end of the ground school, they had about 17,000 left. So that was about 40 or 50 hours of training, but they eliminated quite a number of people right out of the basic ground school. So then they went to Camp Dick. They did some more work there, and then they got sent out to flight schools all over the country. As I mentioned, we had a number of them here, and they also went to other places. What they flew here predominantly were the Jennies. Now this is a Jenny. This is a Jenny without any skin on it, so you can get a good look at this. 2-seat. 8-cylinder engine, and this was the airplane that most of them trained in. It was the airplanes that the British had used. It was the airplanes that we were building, and we were training people. Here's another picture of a Jenny near a hangar. This is a picture of flight instructors at Barron Field here in Fort Worth. And then the hangars that they used were a little bit like this. They could put about 5 of those Jennies inside that hangar. But we had 3 airfields here. Oops. Get this thing to set up where I want it to be. So we had about that here. Now the training itself, you would start out with basic training. And that was an introduction to flight with the Jennies. In this particular case, when we took over the training and we took over the airfields, things changed somewhat. But you did primary training, basic and primary training, which was essentially you were going out and learning how to operate the airplane, land and take off, and those types of things. After that, it became a little bit more detailed. And primary training was about 8 weeks long. And remember, we started out now with 23,000. By the time we got through primary training and 8 weeks of that, we had 11,000 people left who graduated from that. And remember, we were looking to have 5,000 pilots, so we're down to about 11,000. After that, they went into training for either reconnaissance, pursuit training, or bomber training, and this is more the advanced training that was taking place here. Advanced training was another 4 weeks, and again, this was the British and French designation of pursuit, observation, and bombardment. We ended up with a total of about 5,000 pilots out of the 11,000 that started. So we pretty much made that. We made our commitment on mechanics. What we never did, though, was we never got close to the airplanes. We had committed to making about 16,000. We produced some of the several thousand of the Jennies, but in terms of airplanes, combat airplanes, about the only thing that we ended up producing was this airplane right here, which is called the DH-4. DH-4 was a de Havilland airplane that the British had, and then they gave it to us. It was essentially an obsolete airplane. We re-engineered it, and it became a Dayton Wright 4, but it was a bomber, We started to train here when the Canadians left. When we entered the war and the Canadians left, we started doing Thomas More Scouts for pursuit and observation, and then we started to use SPADs for fighter training, which took place at Hicks. You can see here we got a picture of a SPAD and the DH-4. Now the Jennies after the war were used quite a bit by barnstormers. This is Ormer Locklear. He was a local person, famous. If you ever saw the movie The Great Waldo Pepper, he was Waldo Pepper essentially in the movie. He's one of the first of the barnstormers. He knew how to fly a little bit, and he and his commanding officer said, well, why don't you see what you can do with the airplanes? And so Ormer would go out, and they would do things like this, wing walking and barnstorming. And he and his group became known as Ormer Locklear and the Lunatics. And they did a lot of this wing walking and entertaining crowds. They would also, after the war, people were taking the airplanes and going out and trying to make a living with it, because like the old song said, how are you going to get them back on the farm after they've seen prairie? Well, in this case, how are you going to get them back after they started to fly? So these leaflets here, as you can see, they would be thrown out of the airplanes when they'd go over a town and talking about being able to come out and see the airplanes, get an airplane ride, and that type of thing. And so they would fly over a town and drop out these leaflets out of their Jennies. If I can get back here to where you can see it. So it would look a little bit like that. Now, who knows what those leaflets are called? Anybody want to guess what those leaflets were called? We use the term today. But there's the same Jenny that was used for training, and then when it became time for barnstormers, they would paint them up. Okay, those leaflets that they would throw out of the airplane became known as flyers. So even today, people would point up and go, oh, look, flyers. So these leaflets became known as flyers. But back to the training thing. So after all of this time, after all of these weeks, the ground school, the primary training, the basic training, and then the advanced training, the pilots would be ready to fly. Well, today, training is essentially the same. So 100 years later, the basic idea of starting out with ground school and going from ground school, going to a primary training facility, learning how to do primary flying, maybe learning how to do some formation flying, and then going on after that to specialize in helicopters or fighters or ground attack or transports. It's all pretty much the same. Now, some of the techniques are different. We're using a lot more simulators today than ever before. Full flight simulators where you actually get in and for all intent and purposes you are doing the flying. We use those in the airlines. We used them in the military. So that was the point of this, is that this is where the training started. And it's essentially the same thing today. So some things are still with us from the First World War. And that mode of training came to us from the British and from the French. And this is just a little bit more of some of the artifacts that we have here from the First World War of the Royal Flying Corps artifacts. Hi Bart, hi John, it's good to see you guys. Appreciate you being here today for a rainy day lesson in flight training and the evolution of flight training. A little bit of glare here, so sorry about that. But one of the things that the Canadians did was they introduced soccer to the local people here in Fort Worth. And so this was a trophy that they provided. The Royal Flying Corps was only here for a short period of time. They were here for less than a year, from 1917 through 1918. They spent the holidays here. But flight training now, whether it be military flight training or whether it be civilian flight training, is pretty much all the same. You're going to start out with a certain amount of ground school instruction that leads to primary flight training. So the basics of flying, landing and taking off, steering an airplane around, being able to maneuver it, getting into to more advanced training, or primary after basic training, advanced training, where you may start to do airway navigation, radio navigation, instrument training under the hood, formation flying, and some of those more advanced techniques. And then you would go into another aircraft for advanced training, which would in many cases be going to an aircraft carrier, doing carrier landings, going out and doing air to ground and delivering weapons on targets, or going out and flying air to air missions. But after that you would graduate, get your wings, and you would go into a training squadron after that for the airplane that you would be going to. If you're going to F-18s, you'd go to what's referred to as an F-18 RAG, or replacement air group training. Or you would go to, with the Marine Corps, you would go to some place like Yuma, Arizona, to a Marine fighter attack training squadron. Air Force would also put you into primary training for F-35s, 22s, the transports, whatever. But the point being that the training today is essentially as it was 100 years ago. It was a successful model then, and it's a successful model now. And that continues on, and it's just part of the legacy that we have that came to us from the First World War. Once again, I appreciate that you joined us today. Look forward to being able to see some of you in person before long. So again, this is Jim Hodgson from the Fort Worth Aviation Museum, home of the most touchable warbirds in Texas.